Hello, everybody, and welcome to our fourth lecture on personal and organizational communication, which, if you recall from lecture one, make up the third and fifth and sixth levels of our communication pyramid, respectively. So, we're going to start with forms of interpersonal communication. Okay, so I don't want to waste too much time, I'll just jump into it. We're going to skip over intrapersonal communication because there's nothing much that can be said about that. It's really just your internal discussion and your internal decision making processes. Now, for interpersonal communication, we are talking about communication between one person and the next, right? And it can either be formal or informal. So, when is it appropriate to use formal and when is it appropriate to use informal communication? Normally, on a generalized platform, formal communication will be used always unless and until you are speaking with someone that is familiar to you on a personal level. Right, so informal communication generally is used with your inner circle. So you would use informal with your family, with your friends, people that are generally close to you. In some instances, this can extend to your colleagues, but normally we would use formal communication with our colleagues and with people that we do business with, people that we are not familiar with, people that you address as Mr. or Mrs., Doctor, Professor, or Sir, or Ma'am, people that you do not address by their first name, or that you do not address familiarly. All right, so when we talk about interpersonal communication, it can either be verbal, okay, that is using words through your mouth, making noise, okay, that's verbal communication. Non-verbal encompasses body language, right? And then we have written and listening. Okay, let's quickly talk about verbal communication in sport. This is where we use spoken words to share information in a sporting context. Now, informal verbal communication is often used between friends, which is what we have discussed when we were describing those two types, where we say that formal is normally used in a business setting. And verbal communication can either be face to face, where we speak to each other in the same space, or over a distance via a medium like the telephone, like I'm doing now over the internet. Nonverbal communication can be a variety of things. It could be your facial expressions, it could be your gestures, it could be paralinguistics, like the language, the loudness of your tone of voice. It could be your body language, how you sitting, are you sitting upright, are you leaning back, are you relaxed? It could be how you respect or disrespect somebody's personal space, or how close you are when you talk to them. Could be your eye contact. You know how people can tell you're lying by how you make your eye contact, or whether your eye faces left or right, and so on and so forth. Oh, face appearance once more. That's also part of nonverbal communication, as it states what kind of person you are. And then we have written communication. This is perhaps a very important element of communication, particularly in a formal respect, because the transmission of information that is in writing is more precise and explicit. So it's very difficult to misinterpret or misrepresent information in writing, because that information is thought out and you take your time to choose the right words so that it is not ambiguous. So, effective written communication develops and enhances an organization's image. So, it's important to be able to eloquently write what it is that you want to communicate, whether it is to your internal or to your external um, stakeholders. The issue with not writing correctly is that if it is misinterpreted internally, then you might have the wrong product going out, you might have mishaps, you might have wrong orders being delivered, poor service delivery, you might have miscommunication issues that cannot be rectified because there is written communication to confirm that that was the order or the information directly given to whoever's delivering that service. Externally, it could irreparably damage the brand image or the brand's perception as well. Okay. Written communication also provides valid legal records for instances where it is important to keep records for reference's sake, for monitoring and evaluation, and so on and so forth. Right. So, what are some examples of written communication? Off the top of my head, I can think of memos, emails, formal letters, and reports, and all those common things that we use in our workspace all the time, every time. Right. So, there are two types of communication, and I'll just give you a picture there quickly where we look at those two, and we'll go on to talk about them a little bit later. So we do have active and passive listening, um, and those are some of the differences between the two of them. We'll talk about that later on. Right, I want us to talk about effective interpersonal communication skills quickly. Right, um, interpersonal skills rely on a few things. For example, there needs to be active listening involved in order for interpersonal communication to be effective. So you need to be able to actively listen, you need to be flexible, you need good writing skills, you have to be patient, have empathy because you need to understand. Remember ethos, you need to understand where the speaker's coming from, or if you are the speaker, you need to understand the purpose of the listener, because then you need to empathize with how they're going to decode and interpret the information that you're giving to them, and so on. Right. So let's look at some of those elements of interpersonal communication. They remain the same. Okay, we have the sender, we have the medium, we have the message itself, we have the receiver, the encoding and decoding process, interference, which was noise, which we spoke about extensively yesterday, and the feedback, which is the response of the receiver. Now, this is going to come out clearly in the listening assignment that you're going to do. When you watch that video, you're going to identify some interference, some noise in the conversation between Sheldon and Leonard, and you're going to be able to talk about um, how that noise affects the communication between both of them, because they are both the sender and the receiver at different intervals as they're having a face-to-face conversation. Now, let me leave you to struggle with that on your own. I want you to be able to apply that to that situation in practice. Right, so let's talk about communication within. All right, we're still talking about communication within an organization. There are three main types of communication, which is management communication, marketing, as well as organizational communication. Right, so what are some forms of communication in sport organizations? They normally use emails, like we said before, memos, meetings, and so on. Now, I would be very interested to know how you communicate in your own organizations. I know it's quite popular lately for people to use WhatsApp to communicate in their organizations. I know there's been an uprising of Zoom as well, Google Meets, and so on. But what about your own organization? How do you communicate as an institution? So, what are some of the organizational features that affect communication? And this is important, double stars for the exam. We have the mission and the vision of the organization, which we spoke about yesterday, the organization's culture. Okay, that's quite important as it affects how the organization communicates. So, how do the people within that organization fit in together? Do they have a working relationship that allows them to be friends? Do they have a strictly formal working relationship? What is the culture within that organization? Do they have a work hard, play hard kind of culture? Do they have a drinks after work kind of culture? Do they have a I do what I have to do, you do what you have to do, and we'll meet in the boardroom kind of culture. That determines how you communicate or affects the types of communication within that organization. What language is used in the organization? I have been used to working in organizations that strictly use English because they were multicultural. There was a lot of diversity, and it would have been difficult to communicate in colloquial or vernacular languages. I know in Zoom, people tend to use vernacular where they are not supposed to. But what is the language that is used in the organization, and how does that affect communication? For example, if I walk into my local bank and I want help and the teller speaks to me in one of the Zim languages that I don't understand, it's going to be a problem. So it would be better if the language that is used in the organization is a language that is generally used to communicate with the customers, because then everybody's used to using that language. Nobody can then tomorrow say, look, I'm not familiar with using this language. It's difficult for me to think in this language. I can't work with the customers well. That will lead to poor customer service. So, what's the diversity like in your organizations? Do you have a lot of diversity? Is it not as diverse? If you think about countries like Germany, where they have one language in the entire country, they don't have a lot of diversity. They tend to fall into that space where the organization only focuses on that one majority language, and they neglect the minorities, which is a problem. There's not a lot of diversity, however, in the country, so they cannot be blamed for it. If you look at countries like China, for example, where everybody speaks the same language, if you are the minority, then you have a problem because they're not likely to speak the language that you speak. Which is very different from our countries, which are quite diverse, different languages, different cultures, and so on. So, what are some effective communication methods that can be implemented in these instances? And how do those four factors that we've spoken about on top affect those communication methods? Are they going to send emails in Shona? Are they going to send them in English? Will they multi-language them and send them in both Shona and English? How is that going to work? I've worked with universities in the Netherlands who tend to multi-language all their communication. So you'll find communication in both Dutch and English, which I think is tedious. They could have just chosen one language, but suppose that's how they find that's effective. That's an effective communication method for their institution. Right, so we're going to look at those three skills there, which are quite important for communication: listening, reading, and writing. Let's start with passive listening, which we saw there at the beginning. Right, so listening is an activity that engages both the physical function and the mind. And there are two types of listening: there's active listening and passive listening, which I think you all know from undergraduate studies. Passive listening is allowing somebody to speak uninterrupted, kind of like what we're doing now. You're all listening passively. Nobody's giving an opinion, nobody's raising their hand, asking questions. You're just listening to the presentation, and that's it. You're not responding in any way. So that's passive listening. While active listening is reacting while listening to emphasize understanding. So when I speak, you answer the question. When I um, make a point, you can nod, you can say, ah, yes. You know, those are all signs and characteristics of active listening. So, these are some of the listening skills that you might need in order to be considered a good listener. You need to be able to pay attention when somebody's speaking. You need to give the speaker your undivided attention, acknowledge the message, pay attention to body language, give encouraging verbal and non-verbal cues, clarify and paraphrase information. So it's, sometimes when you talk to somebody and they summarize what you have said, that is active listening. When you talk to somebody and they repeat the last line of what you've just said, or they ask a clarifying question of, say, for example, oh, did you say we need to pay attention? Yes. those are the types of questions that you ask to show that you are actively listening. All right. I think we are almost there. Writing skills. When you are writing, first and foremost, the most important thing is you need to know your goal. Why are you writing? What are you writing for? And then once that is established, you need to make your message clear so that your goal comes across. You need to then explain your point concisely. By concise, we mean you don't ramble, you get straight to the point and you make it as clear as possible and then it's easy to understand as possible. Avoid using jargon. A lot of people fall into that trap of using jargon because it sounds smart, it sounds cool, but it's really unnecessary and it confuses everybody involved, you included. So avoid using unnecessary jargon. It's important to proofread your work. Okay, I will be the first person to say that I get bored with my own work and it's difficult for me to read it over and over again. But it's quite important. Once you write something, read it and read it again. Make sure you run your spell check your grammar. I know it's easier these days. You've got Grammarly, you've got spell check installed on your computers, but it's always best to do it yourself as well because the computer doesn't always know what you are trying to say. Some of those changes in grammar will definitely change the meaning of what you were trying to get across. And you need to consider the audience in advance. So you need to know who your audience is before you start writing. So you have a writing exercise. Do you know who you're writing for? Nobody even bothered to ask. So you can ask, what's our scope? Like, who are we writing for? Who's our audience? Are we writing as if we're writing for you? Are we writing as if we're writing for a newspaper? Are we writing as if we're writing for academics? Are we writing as if we're writing for ourselves? It would be a good question to ask, and then you know what approach you're using, you know what word choices you need to use, you know what structure and style you need to use, and so on. So there we go. That's a tip for your assignment. It's entirely up to you whether you take it or not. All right. And reading skills. Now this one is quite important. Unfortunately, I didn't give an assignment this time on reading skills. I did the last time, but I think I'll skip it this time. What I'll do is I will find an interesting article and then I will annotate the first part of it and post it online. You can then take it and do the rest. Right. In order for you to be able to build your reading skills, there is no way around it. You need to read, 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 and read as much as you can. So one of the first strategies to begin with is annotating a text. Annotating a text, I'm sure you've seen our mothers, our grandmothers, our grandfathers, our professors do this all the time. When they read, they take out their highlighters or their pencils and they underline or they highlight text. That is annotating. So you pick up or you identify the most important points and then you annotate them. You then contextualize what you are reading based on what you are reading for. Okay, so it needs to make sense in that context. You then reflect on challenges to your beliefs and your values. That's when you question the paper. That's when you challenge the ideas that are being given out in that script. And then you paraphrase it. You never ever give back what the text says the way it says. You need to write it in your own understanding, in your own words. You paraphrase it. And then you must also be able to give an outline of what you have read. So rather than telling us everything that you have read, you must be able to give an outline. You must be able to read a book and be able to explain it in 5 sentences, for example. That's given an outline. And then it must be easy for you to summarize. If you read a text and you cannot summarize it, you did not understand it. So you did not critically analyze it, you didn't annotate anything, you didn't find any key points, you didn't find any lessons, you learned nothing. So you need to be able to summarize it. Okay. And then it's important to also explore some of the figurative language that is used within that text and look for patterns of opposition within the text itself. So sometimes you'll find that the text will say one thing and then oppose itself in the next line. So you need to look for those types of patterns while you are reading, because they might be important. They might be making an important point either way and then coming down to a conclusion that would make sense if you knew the patterns of opposition within the text. So if you'd like some more practice on this, you're more than welcome to let me know. I'll be happy to help you out. What's important about this reading skill is that it's going to help you when you start doing your dissertation, because you will need this to write up your literature. You will need this skill more than anything else to write up your literature. So if you do need help, let me know. I do have a standard assignment that I set before that you can use to practice your reading skills. So if you need it, let me know. I'll be happy to give it to you and we can go through it again together. It's quite important and it will help you forever. Okay, I think we have come to the end of today's lesson. I didn't take too much of your time. I hope you were able to follow through, and I'll see you all again next time. Bye bye.